Hello future jet aces! In this tutorial we'll go over the important figures of the aircraft, show you how to start the engines, and show you how to restart them in flight. No point in waiting around, let's get right to it! To start the jet engines of the ME262, we'll have to go into the options to make sure that we have the correct key bindings. Be sure to set the engine's ignition switch for the ME262 in an easy-to-reach place, as you'll be using it every time you start the engines. If your engines shut down mid-flight, you'll also need this button to restart them. When you've set your button for the engine's ignition, make sure to check that you've set the horizontal stabilizer, as the 262 uses it, and the toe brakes, as this jet can be a bit cumbersome on the ground. If you'd like to make sure that your buttons are accurate, the black buttons on the throttle are for the igniter, and this long lever is for the horizontal stabilizer. Looking at the gauges, the most important ones for startup are the RPM gauges at the top and the temperature gauges at the bottom. You'll be staring at them for the entirety of your startup sequence, so make sure to get comfortable looking at them. To start engine number 1, set your throttle to 0% and then press the 1 key on your keyboard to select engine 1. Once you have done that, hit the E key or whatever you have bound to start the engine. You'll see the RPMs start to rise, and once the innermost dial says 1000 RPMs, hold the igniter button. Don't let go. I'll turn down the music so you can listen along. As the innermost dial reads 1000 RPMs, hold down the igniter, and the jet engine should kick over momentarily. Once the engine is kicked over and reaches 2000 revolutions per minute, very slowly add throttle until you hit 15%. Once the dial reaches 3000 RPMs, you can let go of the igniter and leave the throttle at 15%. The throttle will be held at higher than 15% at all times by a throttle pull. There we go, engine 1 is successfully started. Let's do engine 2. To start engine 2, we'll need to deselect engine 1 and select number 2 by pressing 1 and 2 on our keyboards. Reset your throttle down to 0% and then push the button to start the engine. Just as before, the engine will slowly rise to 1000 revolutions per minute. Once it hits that mark, hold the igniter. And remember, don't let go of the igniter until you've hit 3000 revolutions per minute. There's 1000 RPMs, let's hold the igniter. Good, the engine's kicked over. Let's get ready to raise the throttle at 2000 RPM. There's 2000, let's gently raise the throttle. It looks like I was a bit aggressive in raising the throttle up to 15%. I overheated for a moment, but it shouldn't cause any long-term damage. And there we go, both engines are now successfully started. Now that we've got the Swallow's engine started, let's taxi over to the runway. Make sure that you have both engines selected and gently raise the throttle while keeping an eye on the temperature gauge. Make sure to keep the temperature gauge in the white on the left side of the gauge, as entering the right will overheat the engine, and an overheating engine is a fire hazard. And by a fire hazard, I mean a near fire guarantee. As the engine spools and the RPMs climb, it's a lot easier to not overheat the engine. But when you're stopped and slow, it's very difficult, so use caution. For educational purposes, we've slammed the throttles all the way forward on this 262 just to show you how bad the fires can be. And you notice almost immediately both engines erupt into flames. And not only that, they get worse and worse. The ME262 does not have onboard fire extinguishers, so if you do catch an engine on fire during taxiing, just end your mission. How about a math question, kids? What happens when you combine a fire with 1,500 liters of airplane fuel? That's right. I'm sorry to have to expose you to such graphic imagery, but I really do need to drive it home that you do need to be careful with the 262 on the ground. Treat her like a lady and you'll have a great sortie. Now that you have your 262 off the ground, we can talk about two of the major peculiarities of this aircraft. The first one is the high-speed Mach tuck that occurs over 1,000 kilometers per hour. The 262 is an incredibly fast aircraft, too fast for its own good even. If you exceed 1,000 kilometers an hour, you put yourself at severe risk of Mach tuck, where the nose becomes incredibly heavy. You lose control and point straight down to the ground when this happens. If you do find yourself suffering from a Mach tuck, standard procedure is to red out and scatter yourself over a large area. Well done! Lowering the 262's power settings too quickly can result in a flameout mid-flight. If this is to happen, immediately drop your power settings down to 0% and hold the igniters. Once the engine turns over, slowly raise the throttle up to 15%. You'll have to be even more careful about raising the throttle back up when you're at speed. It's even more sensitive at this level. Once you get the engines going again, you should be good to go. Just be more careful about lowering that power next time. Before you get on your way, here's a few pieces of information and advice you could do well with. The ME262 gets 15 minutes at the emergency power setting. When taking off, it's advised to set the flaps to 20%, but keep in mind when carrying ordnance or using a shorter runway, you may want to set 60% flaps. If you're really worried, feel free to set 100% flaps. The aircraft still takes off well at this setting. Be very careful on landings as flameouts are very possible. Make sure to plan out your landings and be careful. When you do come in to land, approach at 250 kilometers an hour and try to touch down around 200. And finally, I would suggest going to a public training server to hone your 262 skills so you can go out there and become the true jet ace that you are. Now get out there and bring fighter planes into a new era.